Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're tackling the history of women's civil rights, but we're looking at it through a pretty fascinating lens, economics.
That's right. We've got some compelling material here that suggests, well, maybe we should consider if the economic needs of the state played a surprisingly big role.
In the progression of these rights. Yeah,
Exactly. We all kind of know the usual story, the moral progress one, that steady march towards equality.
sure, and that's definitely part of it.
Absolutely crucial. But the sources we've looked at today, they really push us to ask, were the state's economic needs also a major, maybe even an overlooked driver behind these legal changes for women?
That's the core question for this deep dive, isn't it? We're going to sort of map out a timeline of key legal moments for women
Uh-huh.
and see if we can spot those simultaneous economic reasons the research points to.
Like uncovering some unexpected connections.
Yeah, exactly. It's not about downplaying the fight for equality at all,
Not at all.
but maybe revealing another, powerful layer to the story.
And we've found, well, maybe 4 key areas where these links seem particularly strong.
Okay.
We'll explore how property rights for married women might have affected capital flows,
Right.
the link between women voting and government budgets,
Mm-hmm.
the rise of, Mrs. Consumer,
Yes.
and then finally how more women working relates to, well, pension systems.
Sounds like it could lead to some real aha moments connecting those dots.
Hopefully.
Okay, let's start unpacking this. Let's look at the Married Women's Property Acts. These came in, between roughly 1839 and 1920 in the U.S. and Britain?
That's the time frame, yeah. And fundamentally, these laws gave married women the right to actually own property in their own name.
And control their own income.
Control their own income, which was, a huge shift from before, where usually a husband gained control of his wife's assets upon marriage.
Right. So what's fascinating is the timing you mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
Coinciding with industrialization.
Exactly. The timing seems really significant. As economies were industrializing, there was this growing need for capital and for labor, too.
So how did letting women own property help that?
Well, think about small business owners. If the wife could legally own property or keep her earnings, maybe they'd be more willing or able to invest that capital back into a business or just participate more actively in the economy.
Okay. It removes a barrier, creates an incentive.
Precisely. It's about encouraging economic activity.
So when we talk about capital flow here, are we talking mainly about investing in businesses, land, that sort of thing?
Yeah, that's a good point. In this early stage, yes. It's mostly about investment in new industries, buying land, just getting wealth moving to fuel that expansion.
Okay.
Letting women control their assets meant they were more likely to, well, contribute to that flow.
And do the sources show actual economic effects from these property law changes?
They do, yeah. Research points to a noticeable increase in patents filed by women.
Really? Interesting.
And just more general commercial activity from women after these acts passed.
Which would then expand the tax base.
Right. Through property taxes, income taxes,
Yeah.
hitting a part of the population that was previously sort of invisible to tax collectors.
And all without creating brand new types of taxes.
Exactly. A kind of subtle way for the state to boost revenue. Maybe unintended, maybe not entirely.
And it wasn't just about taxes, right? You mentioned women as borrowers, too.
Correct. As women got the legal right to own property and income, they also became, well, more creditworthy, better candidates for small loans.
Which would stimulate the consumer goods market.
Absolutely, because women now had more independent financial power to actually buy things.
Fueling economic growth overall.
And what's interesting, the sources suggest it wasn't just more spending, but also a shift in the kinds of goods being made and sold.
Catering more to women's needs or preferences.
Yes, tapping into their emerging financial clout and, specific household needs, it really changed the market, created new sectors even.
That's a really important detail.
Mm.
Okay, so let's shift from property and capital. Let's talk about women's suffrage, voting rights.
Okay.
That movement really ramped up late 19th, early 20th century, ending with the 19th Amendment in the U.S. in 1920.
Right.
What's the possible economic connection here?
Well, again, the timing is pretty suggestive. The big push for suffrage happened right alongside the Progressive Era.
Okay, remind us the Progressive Era was about.
It was that period of major social and political reform.
Yeah.
Lots of government intervention to fix societal problems.
Right, which meant more government spending.
A lot more, yeah. Especially on things like social welfare, healthcare, education. Big budget increases.
In the research we looked at, there's a specific study linking suffrage to state finances.
Yes. That Lawton Kenney study from '99, it found that in U.S. states, within the first decade after women got the vote,
Yeah.
state revenues went up by about 13% and state spending by about 14%.
Wow, that's a pretty clear correlation.
It is. Pretty significant numbers.
So what's the proposed link? How does women voting connect to bigger state budgets?
The argument in the research is that women voters, as a group, tended to strongly support those kinds of social programs.
Healthcare, education, welfare.
Exactly. And expanding those programs, well, that costs money. It requires bigger government budgets.
And therefore, more tax collection to pay for it all.
Right. So from this perspective, giving women the vote might have actually helped pave the way for, or at least supported, the growth of the state's financial role.
That's definitely a thought-provoking angle.
It makes you think, doesn't it?
Okay, now let's look at women entering the workforce on a large scale. Thinking like 1910s through the 1950s, particularly around the world wars.
Right, the Rosie the Riveter era and beyond.
The standard story is filling labor shortages because men were at war, which makes sense.
Of course, that was a huge immediate factor.
But what other economic angle do our sources bring up?
Well, alongside the war effort demand, the sources also highlight the parallel growth of the home front consumer market.
Ah, okay. So women earning wages.
Exactly. More women earning their own money meant more disposable income in households overall.
Leading to changes in advertising.
Big changes. This is where we see the real rise of Mrs. Consumer.
Right, I've heard that term.
By the 1910s, 20s onwards, manufacturers and advertisers really started zeroing in on women as the main decision makers for family purchases.
For everything from appliances to food.
You name it. Ads specifically targeted women, creating this powerful new culture of domestic consumption.
And as women's other legal rights expanded too, like signing contracts, getting credit.
That just added fuel to the fire, right? It boosted that domestic market even more.
Which brings us neatly to something like the Equal Credit Opportunity Act of 1974. How does that fit the pattern?
Well, the ETOA was massive. It stopped credit discrimination based on sex or marital status.
Meaning women could get credit cards, loans in their own name without needing a husband to co-sign.
Exactly. A huge deal. And our sources suggest this was a major factor in the explosion of unsecured consumer credit that followed.
Right, because suddenly this whole segment of the population had much greater independent spending power.
Precisely. A huge boost to consumer markets.
Okay, moving closer to our time, the 90s up to today. We see more focus on policies getting women into work, maternity benefits, things like that.
Yes, that's a clear trend.
What's the economic driver behind these policies, according to the sources?
This is where the challenge of aging populations really comes into focus.
Okay. Fewer workers supporting more retirees.
That's the core issue in many developed countries. And big organizations like the IMF, the World Bank, they've explicitly pointed to getting more women into the labor force as a strategy.
A strategy to deal with what? Tax shortfalls? Pension problems?
Both, to help mitigate those growing tax and pension deficits.
So encouraging female employment is seen partly as a way to keep social safety nets solvent.
That seems to be a major part of the thinking, yes. The numbers really back it up.
Like what?
Well, in the U.S., think about this. The percentage of women paying income tax went from maybe 5% in 1900
Okay.
to 65% by 1990.
Wow. That's enormous.
It is. Their contributions are now vital for Social Security, other public funds.
And you said international bodies mention this.
Yeah, the sources note the EU and OECD directly connecting removing barriers for women in the job market to the necessity to replenish the budget of pension systems.
It's not even subtle. It's an explicit economic need.
It's being stated pretty directly on a global level, yes.
Okay, so we've really focused hard on this economic lens, which is the point of this deep dive.
Right.
But it's crucial to remember this isn't the only thing driving change, is it? The sources mention other factors too.
Absolutely essential to state that, yes. The impact of, humanitarian movements, ethical arguments, abolitionism, feminism in its various forms, that's undeniably huge.
Can't separate that out.
In a way. And things like war mobilization, which we touched on, or just basic technological changes that restructure jobs.
Those play a massive role too.
Definitely. And there's one more the sources mention. Competition between places.
How so?
Well, if one state or country lagged behind in reforms, they might actually see capital and female workers move to places with more, let's say, liberal rules.
So competitive pressure to keep up.
Could be, yeah. Another layer to consider.
Okay, so if we try to pull all this together, looking at women's rights history through this economic perspective, what are the main takeaways?
Well, first, I think, is just noticing this consistent pattern. Economic benefits for the state seem to pop up alongside expansions of women's rights.
Even if those benefits weren't the main stated reason for the change.
Exactly. It's a correlation that's hard to ignore once you look for it.
Okay, what else?
Second, these changes fundamentally shifted women's economic role. From being largely kind of invisible contributors within the home
Right.
to becoming really significant independent taxpayers, borrowers, consumers.
Boosting government money and the overall market.
Both, yeah. A dual benefit in economic terms.
And the final key takeaway.
The sources suggest that societies with older populations and more mobile economies, they have a stronger economic reason to encourage women into work and financial independence.
Why?
Because it's seen as maybe a more efficient or less politically difficult way to tackle economic problems like aging populations.
Compared to just raising taxes on the guys already working.
Potentially, yes. It spreads a base.
So the central idea, the implicit correlation from the sources, is basically when the state needs more resources, whether cash in the bank or activity in the economy, that's when women's rights seem to, let's say, mature towards more reforms.
That seems to be the underlying thread that emerges, yes.
It's definitely, well, a different way to frame a history we usually hear told through a moral progress narrative.
It is. It adds another dimension. Doesn't replace the other narratives, but adds to them.
Gives you a lot to chew on.
It really does. And, it's so important to stress again, looking at it this way doesn't diminish the incredible importance of the moral fight, the ethical progress towards equality.
Absolutely not.
But understanding this underlying economic dynamic, well, it just gives us a richer, maybe more complete picture of all the forces that shaped these huge societal changes.
So maybe a final thought for you listening, as you think about all this. How might this economic angle make you look differently at today's debates, around gender equality, economic policy?
Yeah. What unseen economic needs or pressures might be influencing those conversations right now?
It's complex, definitely ongoing. We hope this exploration has given you some valuable new ways to think about it all.
Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.